Somebody has a problem. And when you have a problem, I'll stop the recording. Okay. That's it. Yeah, Fouad, over to you.
Thank you so much, Aritra. Welcome everybody to the second session of the second annual meeting series on the psychology of resistance in violent and repressive contexts. Before we get started, I would like us all to observe a minute of silence for the suffering and deaths of innocents due to oppression, occupation, repression, and violence around the world, whether in the occupied Palestinian territories in Israel, Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, or many other places in this cruel time, and for the dying gasps of the Geneva Conventions, inadequate and toothless as they have been. Thank you. Thank you. Today's discussion will be on the question of political relevance in the psychology of resistance. I'll start by first asking why we need to ask the question of political relevance to begin with. I'll give a few thoughts, but this session is meant for us to think about this together, so I'll only take a few minutes of the time. After that, I'll pose a series of questions for discussion. After each new question is introduced, let's take a few minutes for reflection and jot down some notes on the Jamboard. Editor or Ali will share the link in the chat shortly. Then we'll talk for 10 to 15 minutes before moving to the next question and doing it over again. So the purpose of this is to get a sense of which issues of translational value and practice need the most work from us, according to this group, and hopefully we'll dedicate future sessions to individual questions on that basis. So why ask? First of all, we know that there are discipline-wide issues with relevance and political repression for particularly scholars in the Global South. We know that in the studies that we conducted surveying scholars in the Global South, that many of them complained of undue political influence on the topics of their choosing, and that they felt that much of the literature that does end up getting published in the international literature is not relevant for their context. And many of the participants that we talked to had listed things related to resistance as being one of those things that they felt were underrepresented and understudied in their context and about their context in the mainstream. As well, the psychology of resistance itself is somewhat marginalized area in research and translation relative to other psychological approaches, especially approaches that are more individualizing in their frameworks, focused more on maintaining the status quo, emphasizing quote-unquote order and societal cohesion, and peace, reconciliation, and harmony without justice. Work on the topic itself is highly repressed, especially in what the sociology of science, sociologist of science Hanafi calls post-authoritarian contexts. He was so concerned about the influence of authoritarianism and repression in many contexts in the modern world that he posits that we need to move on from talking about post-colonialism and modern colonialism and talk about the hybridity between colonialism and authoritarianism. And in those contexts, which he calls post-authoritarian contexts, how these contexts affect the production and relevance of our research in the social sciences. More specifically, the translational value and challenges that are relevant to the question of the psychology of resistance are largely unexamined and relatively poorly understood. So resistance psychology often, theoretically, is focused on the phenomenon itself and is etic or amic-etic in approach. It's value explicit and it's ideologically selective, but it's also practically oriented, aiming to facilitate concrete political goals. It also seems to be in early stages, disciplinarily siloed, and in general, inadequate in its ecological validity and translational value. And particularly, it's often irrelevant to or lags localized grassroots knowledge, action, and movements, localized political oppositions, liberation, and liberalization praxis, and localized political authorities, oppression and repression praxis, as well as not really going into questions of cross-fertilization, mimicry, solidarity, and coalitions across contexts and globally. And finally, work on this topic can be really triggering for the researchers engaging in this work, and it can lead to burnout, particularly without a sense of impact. Personally, I think this is a major problem with the sustainability of continuing research on this in this area, particularly when we know that a large proportion of researchers studying these issues are themselves have experienced oppression, repression, and these kinds of, and are involved in resistance. Yeah, okay. So the first question I wanted us to think about together is, do we actually want academic research in the psychology of resistance to be used, especially knowing sort of the limitations that it has and how the research still is somewhat in its infancy in our field. So let's take a few minutes to reflect on that and jot down some notes in the Jamboard, and then
I have, sorry,
continue the discussion.
Yeah, I have posted the link on the chat option, if you can see. So that should be visible to all. If anybody is having any difficulty, let me know. And you can post a note by selecting on the sticky note option, if you can see. Yeah, I just send it to everyone again. Is everybody able to access it now?
Yeah.
Okay. Shall we come back here? Now for the unmute.
Okay, yeah, we have some posts.
Responses.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
So let's open
one
the.
of the
Mhm.
exactly one of the trends I see in responses is between state using the research to implement their status quo, or like putting the hammer down, and being used by the grassroots level policymaker and NGOs or activists, where people say that it should be used more so. I do not think you can publish like that, right? Like, how do you select your audience? Because you might have the state reading the transcript. I mean,
I don't really think it's possible to publish just for one audience or the other. And once it's out there, it's not really possible to control how it's used.
yeah, the resistance to conservative forces within and outside. Yes, probably we probably need to be aware of the application will be limited by resistance, which is resistance itself conservative. I mean, the conservative forces within the discipline itself is another thing. Like, I mean, in the last session, there was a discussion on IRBs not being sensitive enough for contextualized research, or them not having the knowledge to implement contextualized research. So yeah, I think, yeah, fundamentally people believe it should be used, just in the stakeholders. Shall we move to the next question? Or do you want to discuss?
Can we give people a chance to add?
Yeah, sure,
Please
sure.
raise your hand if you'd like to contribute.
Sorry.
You can use the raise hand button at the bottom of the screen, or just unmute yourself and
Yeah.
Okay, doesn't seem like anybody wants to add anything more. We can move on to the next one, which is very, related to that, and it already has come up in the answer to the first question: is how strong is the potential for this research to be appropriated and misused by repressors? To what extent is this really a problem, given that we also our research tends to lag the sophistication of the methods that are being used in repression and oppression by authorities the world over, um, especially now that it's technologically enhanced in multiple ways.
You can put your opinion on the Jamboard or share it here as well. Yeah. One problem I have is how will the oppressor can use the research to learn, right? I mean, about the phenomena, about the ways of resistance, about certain covert techniques, and should we then publish that? Like, say there's a specific ways in which the Kurdish movement is organized, and we publish it, and the Turkish government gets to know, then what happens to that? They might use the knowledge against them itself.
But is it something that they don't already know, is the question.
Yeah, that is the question, right? Mm.
Any thoughts?
Any thoughts? Anybody else?
Should we write our thoughts or we can just speak up?
You can speak if
You
you like.
speak
Yeah,
up.
go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I think that the most, I don't think that, yeah, maybe I'm naive, but I don't think that the content of a critical research can be um, like instrumentalized too much by oppressors as such. What I do think that research on resistance can lead to, when it's done by, not necessarily, but usually when it's done by researchers from the oppressive group, is that they can end up adjudicating on how the repressed group is legitimately entitled to resist or not. So the fact that people from the oppressor group start to frame what is resistant and what is not, I mean, it's an interesting debate to have. Like, I don't think that even if they engage in that kind of research, that also opens up the possibility of disagreeing and of making visible what is going on. I don't know. I think that, yeah, that's my thought.
Thank
Good
you, Andrew.
point there on the potential. There's one, yeah, there's one person who has raised hand. Let me see. Ali, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting question. I just wanted to raise to what extent psychologists are doing research that is basically system challenging to the extent that they can use and control it. So at least most of the research on at least collective action and resistance have the assumptions in their mind that the system is actually quite stable. And in fact, if they want to challenge something, it is just like one technical thing here and there. Is it like, a student fee or something like that? So in a sense, a lot of them has a background assumption that they do not challenge the system itself. And I wonder, is that in fact, it's not so much how they can use the knowledge to control it, but in fact, the research itself has assumed works within the boundaries of what the power has defined already. So in a sense that at least the mainstream social psychological research on resistance, they are already system justifying. They are contributing to the things the way they are. And so that's it would be a different question, saying that okay, we can ask this question when the intellectuals are working actually to challenge the system, to propose an alternative, or to weigh to sort of formulate a way that seems quite different. But I don't see that's the case. So yeah, and I think that's probably one reason that a lot of people in the, as you mentioned at the beginning, in the countries, in the repressed places, they think that a lot of the research do not seem to be relevant because they work within the boundary of the system, and that cannot be applied in a lot of the repressed context.
Right. Also, I have felt that resistance psychologists are study on resistance is more comfortable with song and dance kind of research, where it's very like just validates non-violent kind of resistance, if not something that gives them more happiness. But as soon as things get a little dark, it becomes difficult for them to understand. Shall it be counted as resistance? Where do we stand with it? And so that gray area, the oppressor can take very easy grounds to destabilize the work. Because, I mean, who is going to have a problem with a painting? But
We have
yeah, Anastasia, you have a point.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting, this conversation, and for me it's becoming kind of similar with this question that also some resistant groups may have about participating or not in the institutionalized politics, right? If that is a place to dispute, to what extent participating, like in, let's say, when a movement grows enough or in a way that starts asking themselves that it should dispute established power as part of the strategies of resistance. So in a way, the conversation and the reflections to me seem similar to that, and maybe that can give us ways of thinking about it. Or maybe not. I don't know what you think, but yeah, just sharing my questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also one of my concerns is that as we move away from the focus on certain tactics of resistance to broadening our view of the different ways that people resist, and start looking into things like covert resistance and prefiguration, that these sort of under or less visible forms of resistance, less potentially system destabilizing forms of resistance might come to greater attention to authorities, but also might be uncomfortable for the movements or the people engaging in these forms of resistance, who subjectively might be engaging in them for a variety of reasons, not necessarily only a political reason, but they might be ways of coping, of resilience that they rely on, for their livelihoods. So that raises big ethical questions for me as well, when thinking about the potential for misappropriation.
Yeah.
Would anybody else like to share any thoughts or follow-ups on what's been said on this question? Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, Meta.
Yes, my comment very limited with the social psychology and political psychology, maybe. I can't see huge risk because social psychology research on collective action and resistance do not provide knowledge about the daily life resistance, like very daily life resistance. We mostly provide knowledge on big events like demonstration riots and so on. And I mean, even if the repressors appropriate or misuse this information and use for repression of the crowds, it's not a problem as far as we continue to daily life resistance, because daily life resistance end up with the huge demonstration, huge riots at the end. So I can't see big risk because of the limitation of our research.
I think that's interesting because, I mean, sure, in resistance, we're looking at a variety of different practices, but that includes sort of the mass resistance aspect and violent resistance and things like that. The question, though, like, is if that's the case, that they already know all there is to know about mass resistance, and they doing research on that isn't going to alter sort of the dynamics of repression, then really what's the political relevance of studying everyday resistance? And in addition to that, if we hand over some information about the psychology underlying resistance, broadly speaking, regardless of tactics, isn't that ammunition that people can use for informational operations, for psychological warfare, for propaganda, for ways of suppressing and preventing resistance before it occurs, rather than repressing it after it does?
Makes sense. Makes sense, definitely. I mean, I feel like who is the repressors in here? I mean, if you mention about the repressors in a broader aspects, or if we mention about the repressors within the discipline, I mean, for me, I can see the problems in here. I mean, if we mention about the repressors within the discipline, you're right. But in a broader context, I think we are not there yet. So I feel like we need to continue to produce that knowledge first, because the institutional apparatus, institutional repressors are so slow to, change their tactics. So I feel like the everyday resistance, or our knowledge, if we can produce somehow, will be more flexible. So we will be one step ahead from them if we start to produce that knowledge.
Good. Anybody else? That's it. We move to the next question. Yeah, I think we can move to the next question.
Okay, yeah, there's more to talk about there. It's a very interesting.
Yeah.
But we'll move on to the next question. Can or how can actual resistance movements or opposition parties find net benefit from the research that we do? So what are the factors that influence when and how people use this kind of research and practice, if they do? Enzo?
Yeah, I think that one way in which research can benefit resistance is by legitimizing certain practices, giving credence to the benefits of such practices for those communities or the entire community as a whole, and in that sense feeding cognizance in our scientific communities about these practices. That's a concrete way, I think.
Interesting. So in a way, the sort of doing research on this and sort of understanding why people are doing certain things, it gives it a kind of intellectual stamp of approval in a licentious kind of way.
I think
Yeah.
so. And sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Enzo,
No,
carry
I
on.
think so, and especially if the person, the researcher or the group of researchers involved in such a project are also part of that community. Of course, they will provide insights that majority group members wouldn't. And on the other hand, it's also a way for them as members of those groups to take up a space in our communities, like scientific communities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. One way, I was recently reading this article on the Kuwaiti resistance against Iraqi occupation. And the author says that therapists or researchers have a duty to double listen, in that they not only have a duty to listen, but also highlight in ways in which the participants uh, thought of being passive is not really passive. Like they were not just the victims, but actively work their ways around, which could lead to them being more compassionate towards themselves. That could benefit the community, I guess. I mean, not necessarily people who are actively committed to the resistance, but people who are sort of at the borderline, perhaps. I mean, fence sitters kind of people.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Manuel, you had your hand up.
Yeah, has a point.
Yes, hi. Just a quick thought, because all of these are very interesting questions. I think, and regarding this one, I would say at least thinking in the experiences I know here in Ecuador, where I am working and living, probably we have a lot more to learn from social movements and groups of political resistance than they have that what they can learn from us. That doesn't mean that our knowledge, the knowledge we produce, cannot be useful, cannot benefit them, especially in terms of legitimizing them, as our colleague said before, and the issue of representation, including these voices and these experiences of resistance in our papers, in our textbooks, and so on. But I think this is quite limited, in at least for some of us, regarding our ambitions, the way we would like for us to be able to actually benefit those struggles. So I was just thinking of Martin Baró in this point. He was very clear in his position that psychology itself will not, it's not the place of psychology itself to kind of do this, to be the lead actor or the protagonist of this knowledge that will lead to resistance and social change. It's just a small one. We are one of the actors, and in fact we should probably accept that and not aspire that we will benefit. We will be the main benefactor with our knowledge, our epistemic positions regarding social change. Just a thought, but this is a very important question, I think.
Thank you. Hakan?
Yeah. Hakan?
Yeah, thank you. My comment's gonna refer partly to Manuel's and Aya's article 4. I think the asking this question can be even a bold attempt, especially when it comes to mainstream social psychology's practices. So most of the times we have our theories, we have a theory-driven research, and we ask certain questions without knowing what lay people think about, what movements think about our way of asking questions. So at the end of the day, our practices produce a knowledge that detach from the reality most of the time. And we as social psychologists, by social psychologists, I mean the mainstream social psychologists, we are so detached from reality. We are genuinely interested in real world phenomena and assuming that our research touch upon the suffering of people. But when we reflect upon our research and when we share this knowledge in a plain language with, daily life people, they just surprised how we approach these questions and the social issues. I think asking this question in this way even might be sound patronizing to certain people. And I think first we should get benefit from resistance movements and opposition parties as to how we can do a real life touching research.
So the overall sense that I'm getting is that, the research itself is too immature at the moment to even be worth thinking about application. And instead we should be focused on increasing its own sort of validity and legitimacy before we think about translation. Is that the sense that people have?
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Manuel writes, our work may help legitimizing resistance movements, but their generosity when they share their knowledge with us actually legitimizes us as critical scholars and so on. Yeah, it's a dialectic of sorts. Like they validate us and we legitimize them. Yeah.
I agree. It is a very ethically challenging relationship, Manoj. Thank you for that point. Anybody would like to add anything here?
This is a great question. Yeah.
Okay, so related to this, I wanted to see what thoughts people had on, or what knowledge people had about what the pipelines are currently between academia and praxis at the moment. So I know a bunch of us straddle that line ourselves, being scholar activists. But beyond these kind of weak links between those networks, what other ways does information go back and forth between academia and praxis? And do we need to think about enhancing that bidirectional communication between academia and praxis more?
I think one major problem I find is global North scholars in global North universities or global South scholars in global North universities navigating everything that they have done and then theorizing on global South context with variables that, as Ali pointed out, demand stability. But global South resistance is a lot pragmatic based. I mean, it's more situational context, a lot of, I mean, it does not make sense to global North context at most of the time, but the variables, the theoretical impositions do take place. So that often does not translate to the people who are mostly repressed and are resisting versus people in the global North who are theorizing on resistance work. Ali, you have a point?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring our attention to the comment that Aya put in the chat. I think that's very relevant one here. I think she's at work and probably she can't speak up. So I'm going to read her comment in the chat, which points to actually the lack of the pipelines between academia and practice. So she writes some thoughts and barriers we would need to overcome: remove paywalls and publish open access, translate into language beyond English, write in non-academic terminology, and form organic, not just post-research links with civil society, resistant groups for co-creation and dissemination of research, and generally abandon our commitment to neutrality or separation from communities and observers. So in a sense, I think there are quite a lot of barriers between academia and research. And I think she points some good directions to take in case we want to increase that connection.
I think, yeah. Any other? Anyone else?
So what I also hear is that the pipelines within academia are also somewhat broken, and between, particularly in terms of the ways in which northern and southern research relate to each other, is problematic to begin with for academia, and is part of the problem in blocking those pipes between academia and practice, particularly in the global South.
Yeah.
Is that a fair summary? And would anybody like to add anything? Yeah, go ahead.
I think, I mean, in funding is, I think right now, just thinking out loud, like who would fund a research on Palestinian movement right now? I mean, because you have such high level of repression within university bodies who are not even entertaining the question of the existence of Palestine. I mean, it's a student-driven movement that we are seeing mostly, or worker-driven movement. Now, you propose in, say, 2 months' time, I want to do a research. I mean, who is going to be the funder of such a research? So that's, I mean, the funder is essentially dictating what you can research on. So, yeah, that's.
Yeah, I mean, we saw in our studies that the funders were really the primary mode of influence on topic choice in the global north. The question is that dependency on funders also the case in other contexts in the South? And could we think about ways in which South-South academic collaboration might be helpful for praxis? Something to think about, maybe. All right. So if nobody has anything to add, we can move to the next question.
Okay.
Okay. So this is something I think we can all talk a little bit more with a little bit more authority about. How do we ourselves cope with the rising levels of censorship and suppression of research, even in more open societies? And this relates to your point, Eritrea, about the repression of research on or even discussion of Palestine, the Palestinian issue. So yeah, thoughts, everybody? Ideas, things that you've been doing, things that you've noticed have been effective in helping you sort of deal with this kind of repression of intellectual freedom?
So I've been thinking a lot about publishing all my, I mean, the talks I had planned. I mean, the papers or conference papers I had planned on YouTube or some other platform, instead of presenting them at conferences or bodies which cannot issue any type of solidarity statement or anything. That's, I mean, probably might have a bigger reach as well, instead of putting it in the silo of social psychologist. But that's me. That's just me.
Thanks, Eritrea.
Anybody else? Let's hear the creative ways in which we'll do the research. Reaching out to others that are resisting to within academia, having a sense of community and knowing that I'm not on my own.
Yeah, that is an excellent point, Anastasia. Thank you. Yes, Meta.
Like Anastasia said, finding like-minded people is very helpful to survive. And also going outside the institutional academia is very refreshing, you know, talking with the activists, real activists, not like me, the activists, and how they deal with the censorship and suppression, because like heavy suppressions, again, not like us. Listening to their experiences is very helpful, and also helpful for, you know, figure out what we are doing as academics. What is our aim? Is it a real, or it's like a show kind of thing? So it's it's create a more critical thinking about what we are doing in general. So going beyond academia it's very good thing to do.
I will note that when we were looking for contributors to our upcoming edited volume, that almost all of the contributors ended up being expatriates or extremely vulnerable politically and in terms of their, and precarious in terms of their jobs, in exile. In general, it was very hard for us to find people doing work in their countries on the repressions in their countries. And I wonder to what extent sort of reliance on expatriate scholars is helpful, or whether doing that also separates a little bit the research from what's happening on the ground.
All right, so Ali, you want to, yeah, Ali?
Yeah, so it's also a little bit of an ethical question. So I think when I want to collaborate, then with my colleagues in Iran or elsewhere, then the topics that we can study is actually quite limited, because you don't want to put their life in sort of danger.
Ali, you're mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's it's also then it's an ethical question to what extent what topic can be studied, and in that sense I think it's an ethical question, and I think that perhaps doing research in repressive context requires a different kind of ethical procedure, that it's throughout the whole process of research, and that also involves a little bit of censorship given a precarious situation. Yeah, so I think in that sense it's I don't see it as a pure level of censorship, but also a little bit of ethical understanding of people in those countries that are doing research, because you don't want to put their life in danger.
At the same time, you also don't want them to be silenced, right? So there's a balance one has to strike.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you, Aya, so much for your contributions and for being here despite being at work. Have a good day.
Thank you, Aya. There's also, like, I mean, the thing was addressed in the last one as well. What happens when the participants want their names to be out? Like, they want, and that's, I mean, it becomes very difficult to navigate that terrain when they say that, put our names out. I want my name to be there. That's all we have. Why are you denying us this? So that becomes a difficult zone for coping itself, I guess. Like focusing on the ethics of care for our participants and benevolence and all of that, keeping them safe, but also, I mean, highlighting their agency, respecting their choice.
I mean, that's all very well and good, but I mean, in the cases where you simply cannot do anything as a researcher in a given context, you cannot give voice of any kind to a given community or resistance movement. How do we deal with that? If that can't be done internally, domestically, indigenously, can it be done from abroad? Should it be done from abroad? is if the only other option is silence, is that better or is that bad in a different way?
Any other points? How are people coping with the rising levels of censorship? Yeah.
Yes,
Research-wise, I feel like some methodological changes can help to overcome of this suppression and silence, because we have a very limited tools when we think about how we can conduct research or how can we raise people who are raise voice of the people who suffer, like conducting the different methods that we don't use normally can helpful. Like in this time, I think about autoethnographic research sometimes. I mean, when I was in Turkey, I think about a lot. Some of my research friends, when they are in exile, conduct this. And it's really helpful to overcome some level of suppression. So it's not ultimate, but at the end, a little bit voice. I mean, better than silence.
That's a great point about the toolkit, and definitely that's an interesting suggestion with the autoethnography. Thank you. Those are very interesting points. Manuel?
There's Manuel.
Yes, I'm listening and reading all of your experiences and ideas regarding this question, and I can relate to many of them. I find all of them very valuable. And I just wanted to share one example of, first, probably a broad idea. I was thinking that in my case, at least, I'm not alone here, we have to kind of choose how radical we are, to put it in a word, in terms of our academic work around resistance. So in some situations, we may want to go, reject the mainstream institutionalized, psychology, even social psychology, political psychology, and just refrain from publishing high impact journals and all of this, publishing game and so on, just to name an example. And in other situations, we also want to use those platforms and use however power we may have as scholars to also include the work we do and the work social movements do in those platforms. So I was thinking in the second case, where we actually want to put it in our work from the cracks, the cracks of these colonial, if we want to use the term, institutions, we have to translate, or I wouldn't use the term tone down, but kind of translate to kind of adapt, especially the language. This is at least my experience in one or two occasions. The language we use without keeping it political and clear, not ambiguous, but making it somehow potable to those platforms in a way, without allowing it to be co-opted and toned down from its political essence. So just to share with you one particular experience, there's this paper we have just submitted some time ago with a colleague here in Ecuador, and the paper is on the topic of violence, but it's also on the topic of necropolitics. So as you can imagine, when we talk about necropolitics, we are moving into more critical terrain. But my colleague, this is the anecdote, if you will, is that my co-author, it's a very, very mainstream psychologist here in Ecuador, absolutely conservative in his political views, the complete opposite of my position in psychology and outside psychology. And I found it to be a very interesting experience for me personally, because I've never thought we will be co-authors ever. I like him person, I like this person. So we were just chatting one day over coffee on the paper I was writing on this subject, and he was very interested, to my surprise. So yes, we did have to. there was some pedagogy involved, in the sense, not from a patronizing position, but this is language that he didn't know. He didn't understand what colonial mean in psychology. So I have to very horizontally and respectfully, without patronizing him or saying you are the oppressor because you are a mainstream psychologist, you know, just actually having a very Freirean, like in Paulo Freire, sorry, Paulo Freire's approach to pedagogy. Just yes, I see you, I hear you, I know what your positioning is. This is mine. We are on opposite sides in many respects. And we were able to write a paper where we actually used the word colonial and necropolitics, and he kind of learned about it. I think that's also a very everyday practice. For me, it was a new experience, never happened to me before. And it opened a new possibility. So maybe that's used for others. I don't know if anyone else had that experience before.
Manuel, was it a oppositional paper? Like, I hold this end of the debate, you hold this end of the debate, or was it a... I'm
It is
just
a
very curious.
literature review on the psychology.
Okay.
It's a literature review on the psychological research on violence in Ecuador and how it's missing the political dimension of violence, to put it in a word.
Right.
Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah,
Thank you.
that is also an interesting question about whether we should sort of bubble off into radical isolates, or whether we should try and work through the avenues of power that are available, or whether we should try a hybrid approach where we use both. And your anecdote really shows, you know, that it is possible to do both in some ways. So thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? How are we coping with the current situation? Or how have they coped previously? That would be very interesting for us to learn a thing or two.
Okay, we can move on to the next question then.
Yeah.
So, relatedly, of course, how do we reach people in places where research or resistance are repressed? So, you know, in some places, YouTube itself is blocked, Eritrea. So, what are the avenues? What are the ways in which we can reach people, whether for research or for, you know, support and solidarity, in places that are that repressive?
I think we put those in the Jamboard itself, because that would be a very interesting set of knowledge that we might have.
Yeah, feel free at any time to put your answers on the Jamboard, if you'd rather not, and share them in audio. Okay. If there are no thoughts on this, I guess we move on. This might
Ali
be...
has a thought.
Ali, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that reaching out to people in other cultures also should be a little bit. I mean, there's been a trend now, sort of, you know, doing cross-cultural research, and people in developing countries have been used just to collect data and to be part of a paper, and that's also another way of, you know, a colonial approach to doing research, so to say. So in a sense, people have been just used as a type of assistant to be part of a paper, but just to admit that, yeah, okay, we are presenting a cross-cultural data, we are testing our theory in a different culture, etc. And I think, so we also need to think about how to reach out to people in other places, especially in repressed context, in a way that they are part and parcel of the research process rather than just using them for data collection. So that's an additional point to the question, I guess.
Thanks, Ali.
This is a very difficult question because there are actual internet curves at places in my country that I know, like in Kashmir and all, where even if you research, the research is very hard to get there. So that's so difficult, right? Yeah.
How do we have a comment? Let's see.
Knowing people from repressed communities is the key. While I was in Turkey, every time it made things easier to reach out to the marginalized communities when we approached them together with our friends from the community for data collection. But there were more severe issues at systematic level. The ethical committees generally suppress researchers as well, right? The ethical committees can be very conservative itself, very conservatively oriented.
Yeah, and I wonder, with many of these communities that are difficult to access, they are engaged in resistance outside of the locations in which those the bulk of that repression is happening. So how do you feel about working with diaspora communities as a way to get dialogue going between researchers and these communities as the link?
I have one problem with the diaspora community, that is their social mobility often is higher than the people in the ground. Like, so that for me is often, I mean, their aspirations are often very different from the people at the ground. Their mobility is often very different. So that's my issue often with researching with diaspora community. But I Anybody else, any thoughts? And especially if they have migrated to the United States or Europe, I mean, they have a different sense of homeland, a different idea of what is pragmatic politics for them, real politics, than the person at the ground who is trying to get by or something like that. I think many of us,
I mean,
I'm not
nonetheless, we shouldn't you know, talk about diasporas as monoliths, right? You do have some groups in the diaspora that are extremely politically active and so well connected to their original communities and are, you know, engaged in constant political on behalf of those communities. And I do agree that there are good portions of diaspora communities that might be in a more sort of resilience and survival and sort of moving on kind of state of mind that would make it quite different talking with them about these issues than it would be for people still in those communities.
Can I say something?
Of course, go ahead.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So I'm Iram, and I've been studying in IIT Delhi, and as part of my PhD project, I've interviewed Dalit activists in India, which is historically and severely marginalized population in India. So what I've done is I try to explore how they make use of digital media for the advancement of their community and for the upliftment of their social group. So as far as reaching people in areas where, you know, the research is repressed and, you know, resistance is also kind of repressed, I think people who are working for their community, especially the activists, they they try to bridge this gap between researchers and the people who are on the ground, because they often work as proxies for, because especially the people who are connected with um, the ground practices of activism, they kind of work like proxies for their community. Because I have some anecdotal evidence where, you know, a lot of activists did say that if even if, you know, digital media has not reached such kinds of places, we ourselves go there, we connect with people, we raise their concerns, and we bring it to the fore. So maybe we can look for some kind of gatekeepers, um, gatekeepers in the sense that, you know, these activists are good, um, can be considered a good gatekeeper for entering those communities and bringing out their concerns to the fore. That's my personal experience that I want to share. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing, Ira. Okay, if no one has anything to add to this question, we can move to the next one.
Yeah.
So the question of translation is also interesting because we know that certain psychological frameworks have been used and used quite a bit in applied intervention, in ways that perhaps not all of us are happy with. And the kinds of psychology that are used in this way, like I mentioned at the beginning, tend to be, in the more mainstream, tend to be more individualizing, more focused on sort of helping people individually cope with certain things, helping people, well, not helping, but trying to change people's attitudes or ideologies in ways that maintain order and stability and things like that. So for me, a question that arises from the fact of this matter is, how do we compete for translational impact with these kinds of less liberationist psychological frameworks, coming from a politically and academically more marginal position?
Can I intervene?
Go ahead, Enzo.
Yeah. I think that, yeah, like, I think that doing research about how to address, for example, more structurally and collectively social, psychological issues and situations of repression. I think that, yeah, sometimes it seems to me that liberation or oppression or inequality sometimes can be taken as face value, and you actually don't find too much research and robust research on what does it mean a structural policy, what does it mean address a problem, or what are the psychological underpinnings of people preferring, for example, structural policies over individual merit-based policies. So in that sense, I think that we have still a lot to do, because even though, like, for us can be very evident what are the situations that we are talking about when we talk about oppression, actually our research tradition doesn't have the resources for sometimes to address or the language to address and to translate those concerns into an applied setting. And on the other hand, I think that talking about the applied setting means as well, or implicitly states, that we have a will to power, like that we have a will to take up spaces. And that means, legitimizing our standpoints scientifically and theoretically, and translate them concretely into, for example, it's only one way, but policymaking. That's one way. There are others. But yeah, I think that we have a lot of research to do for as well. Well, that doesn't impede taking action, of course. But yeah, I think that it's also about doing robust research on these issues.
And where would you think it would be best to start that process?
I mean, personally, for example, I started to be interested in this distinction between preference for individual-based policies versus structural policies, and I realized that actually there is no there is no psychological research, like too much psychological research on this, and it was like, okay, we are talking about like how much we want to address issues structurally and collectively and so on, but actually we are not, like, there is no too much research on this. So how can we legitimize, for example, our positions in a table where decisions are made politically if we don't have our own language, which is the psychological scientific language, on our side to translate our concerns into practice? So it might, yeah, that's what I'm doing. But I think that there are multiple ways of dig into this, of course. How about you? What do you think, Fouad?
I mean, I absolutely agree that the place you're starting from sounds really, really interesting and potentially, you know, revolutionary in some ways. But for me, yeah, like not a mutually exclusive thing, but looking more into, I've been looking more into elite psychology, and then sort of flipping the spotlight onto sort of the dominant, more from a more critical perspective, and trying to understand sort of the mechanisms of oppression and repression using sort of the language of psychology a bit more, so that we can speak to, you know, sort of the to these mechanisms from a variety of different viewpoints in ways that make things like corruption and authoritarianism and things like that not about, you know, how people generally feel, but about how elites practice them, and about how elites use them, and about how elites leverage them in politics specifically. And I think that kind of information is really, you know, highly valuable for people, you know, working in opposition or in resistance, and is completely absent as far as I can see in our field. So that's been kind of one direction I've been going with that in for doing this. Yeah.
Interesting. Todd, can you give an example of, I mean, without you getting into trouble, like a data point, if that's possible? I'm just so interested in.
Yeah, so I've been looking into doing some archival research into, you know, how these networks of elites set up things like the tax haven system globally, and how they like engage in this kind of collective action to sort of extract wealth at a global scale, and using some of these archives to kind of figure out network structures, figure out sort of some potential like norms and motivations that might be related to this kind of behavior.
Interesting. Anybody else? That's super interesting though. Yeah, Manuel?
Yes, I was thinking of the type of situations where doing robust research from a scientific point of view, enough validity, representation, and so on, is just not enough. I was thinking of particular scenarios of repression or oppression or structural violence or censorship. I mean, we have a lot of examples of this. We can talk about the scientific evidence for what's going on now in Palestine. We could talk about the scientific evidence for what would have been humane and more effective policies during COVID. We have a lot of examples that are quite of global relevance, and also examples of very, very local relevance that sometimes we don't hear about or other people don't know about. So in those situations, my argument would be, and not only my argument, of course, it's a decade-long argument, that science itself, like pure scientific research, even if it's applied research, is just not enough. Evidence-based policymaking and all of that, yes, it have a very important place. I'm not arguing that. I would never argue that. It's a form of epistemic power and cultural power. We can talk with data, we can talk with findings and so on. But sometimes it's just, even if you have all the data, all the findings in the world, if those empower in a particular context or scenario, just ideologically, it's not in their benefit or the benefits their economic and cultural groups they represent to actually listen to the science that you are doing or anyone is doing. It's just, I think that's the type of situations faces up with the challenge of actually, I wouldn't say we have to become activists necessarily, but to find other ways that are not just purely scientific to resist. So that's just a thought that I think is quite important to consider, alongside with what you just said, which I agree with.
Absolutely, I think there's no real alternative. I mean, yes, the research, like you said, the research is important, but also every person is also politically responsible, right? And politics is, in the end, what this is all about. So one has to be engaged in politics as well as in research, in my view.
More 5 minutes.
Yeah, we're almost at the end. Anybody would like to add anything on this question?
Is it the last question, Fouad?
Essentially, I had a couple of questions about, so how do we make doing this kind of research more sustainable and meaningful for researchers in the sense that making it feel at least more subjectively impactful.
Yeah, just wanted to make a comment that might be also related to the next question, and that is also about making alliance. I think that's at least what we do is probably not so common in social psychology, but there are other disciplines that are basically working on everyday resistance, all sorts of sort of critical research that basically are in line with the way we are thinking about, like in anthropology and political science and sociology. So I think that's in a sense, we're not so much saying that, okay, we're going to compete with the mainstream psychology, but rather saying that, okay, making alliance with and doing interdisciplinary research with researchers who are actually a little bit better equipped with dealing with these topics. So might be also one way that making research a bit more sustainable and also more critical, and in a sense, getting out of the marginal position, so to say, that by having interdisciplinary alliance with critical disciplines.
Yeah.
Okay, would anybody like to add any final points before we conclude for today? So I hope that this discussion will be continued. If you'd like to propose similar dilemmas discussions in the future, please feel free. One of us will put in the link now for
Yeah, I'll just put it.
how to register a proposal for a talk or a dilemma session. Thank you so much for being here and for your contributions.
This is the link. I think everybody can see. Yeah, Ali has also posted the same link, I guess. It's on, yeah, we would love more voices to come out, more voices, especially in context of repression, who are actually embedded in researching such things. And especially I have a, I mean, prevalent, what do I say? Like a preference for people who are actually in the Global South doing research on Global South, or yeah, so that would be very interesting. So yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. I've also put in the links for the mailing list if you would like to be informed of future sessions, and the website where we're posting recordings of the sessions that are being recorded, and announcing future events as well.
And if you have suggestions, always welcome to mail us, at least. I'll stop the recording right now. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank
Very
you,
interesting.
Fouad, for hosting and proposing these.